Awesome, thank you. Well, hello everybody. As our host has just said, my name is Orin Lockyer, and I've been a social scientist at BRANZ for 2 years now. And prior to this, I completed my master's in sociology at Victoria University of Wellington. So today, I'm here to talk to you about a project I've been working on probably since the beginning of this year, which is exploring the relationship between new build clients and their builders in residential construction. So the reason why we're doing this research in particular is because previous research at BRANZ, specifically our New House Owners Satisfaction Survey, which tracks the performance of residential builders in New Zealand, had identified that communication was consistently rated poorly by new build clients. And we wanted to understand what exactly was going on in that communication process. Why was it that builders scored so low when it came to their communication during the build process? And coincidentally, when we designed this project, there was somebody else looking at this topic as well. And so this research project was done in partnership with Dr. Kate Bryson, who worked with RMBA and NZCB. So RMBA is Registered Master Builders Association, and NZCB is New Zealand Certified Builders Association. So probably the two largest associations when it comes to builders. And they were interested in the impact on mental health and well-being of builders because of communication practices with clients. So they had found that their members had reported that communicating with clients was some of the most stressful parts of their job currently. So with that in mind, we developed our research around two kind of key questions. The first one was, what are the current tension points in the communication practice between builders and new build clients? And how does communication practice impact build quality and builder well-being? The first question there is to really identify, well, we've heard these anecdotal stories. What is actually going on here? And can we see any trends or themes across a much broader sample? And then obviously, if there is tension in communication practice, what is the impact on both the buildings that's being produced and the well-being of both builders and clients? I would also, just before I go on, I'll also explain the difference between, the working definitions of builders and new build clients. So when I say new build clients in particular, we mean individuals who have contracted a building company to build their house. So when we selected our sample, we avoided companies or houses that the builder had built for themselves, things like that, because sometimes in consent data, you'll see both the builder as a builder and as an owner. We didn't think that would be very helpful because the builder's just building his own house himself. So we only picked clients who had contracted a building company for our sample. When we say builders, we're meaning anybody that the client interacted with during the build process. So that could be the project manager, that could be the owner of the company, that could be subcontractors, that could be the main builder on site. It was more about how did that client interact with the build process overall. So in terms of our methodology, we did two initial surveys, so one for new build clients, one for builders, and then we followed that up with semi-structured interviews with about 50 semi-structured interviews, 30 new build clients and 20 builders. So we did this during lockdown. This was probably around March to April that we did the majority of our data collection. And so all of our interviews were over the phone. It was the only way that we could do our interviews. And we also found that, it was quite interesting actually. So when we were doing our builder interviews, the first 20 interviews went very quickly because all the builders were in lockdown in level 4. So we actually got a lot of our data then. We were aiming to hit 30 interviews, but as soon as lockdown finished, so as soon as level 4 finished, we were unable to get any more builders to interview because level 3 happened and everybody was back on the job. So that's why there's a bit of a disparity in terms of the 30 new build clients versus the 20 builders in terms of our data. So moving on to, what we found. When we're looking at communication difficulties, in the surveys, builders told us that they were speaking to clients multiple times a day. So we had 82.6% of our builder sample reported dealing with clients outside of business hours. So the load on builders was near constant. They were always communicating with clients. It's important to add here that these multiple contacts don't mean a singular contact. It's that they were having to deal with multiple clients throughout the day. So it was never just, it could have been one client, but it was more builders had multiple clients on the go that they were all managing their expectations. So when it comes to why this was a challenge, other than just the regular amount of contact, is builders told us that one of the key difficulties that they found was managing clients' expectations because of clients' access to knowledge. So builders agreed that the internet wasn't necessarily a bad thing when it came to helping clients figure out like the functional aspects of the build, like where do you put your windows? Have you got your financing sorted out? What is it about your the space of the room that you were doing? What they found is that clients started to question their ability as builders and started to push back on the more performance aspects of the build. And this quote here is quite a good illustration of one particular builder. So he's talking about like back in the early days, the builder would come in and would know everything, they knew nothing. And he's found that, and this is him reflecting on his journey through building, that he was in a position of autonomy, that he could basically just do his job and get things done. Whereas now he's talking and coaching clients through how to do the build process, why they choose specific materials, and sometimes being challenged on his particular way of building. There was one particular example where a builder was telling me about a client who watched him lay brickwork, so doing brickwork for cladding. Everything was fine. The client went away, watched a couple of YouTube videos and called him the next day and challenged him, saying, hey, you're not doing the brickwork properly. And the builder asked, well, what are you talking about? And he says, well, I watched a couple of videos. I know you're not doing it properly. And so we had a lot of moments like that where clients are coming into the build with a little bit more knowledge, and that's starting to push builders a little bit more, and they're having difficulty handling those particular communications with clients. So following on to, I guess, client communication difficulties, and this idea around professionalism and trust, clients, when we talk to clients who have challenges with their builders, they're often torn between being a good client, so as builders described as somebody who listens to their builder, trusts in their professionalism and expertise, or being a more assertive client who played a more active role during the build process. So what I mean by a more active or more assertive client is normally clients who were in a more active role in the build process was because of a couple of things. So the main thing was the builder had failed to provide an update to the client that was expected upon contract. So this could be things like they could have agreed before the contract was signed that there would be weekly updates. The builder misses a weekly update and the client goes, this is a concern, I need to be more involved, I need to see what's going on here. And that would often mean a visit to the site. And this is where the tensions between builders and clients were quite prominent. It's when a client was on site unsupervised and they had noticed what they perceived as a defect. And that more assertive client role, it shifted into more of a QA role. So now the client went to site, saw that there was an issue, or what they perceived as an issue. The builder had not told them about that particular issue. And so their concern was, well, now actually I have to be a lot more in control of this build process. Otherwise, I'm not going to know what's going on. And what this tension, I guess this new tension, what we found from this new tension is that when clients identified issues, we could see the balance of power between the two and how it's often unfairly weighted towards the builder. So this is one particular client who's talking about his concreting for his driveway. So he's talking about how, well, it does look a mess, but I really don't know if it's worth going back to the builder now and saying this still isn't right. So they've gone back and forth multiple times where the concreters have come out and said, hey, it's fine, there's going to be cracks in it, this is just how it is. And the client's gone, that's not what I expected. I've laid concrete before. I'm in possession of knowledge that tells me concreting shouldn't be like this. but that's the extent of that discussion. The client has no control over whether or not the builder is going to fix the defects. The client itself is dependent on the builder validating what is considered a defect or an issue. So a client can bring something up, but there was no other third party or a regulatory system for a client to be able to contest what their builder had done when they thought they had identified an issue. And this was often a cause of tension and a breakdown in the communication overall. So what are the implications of some of this kind of poor communication practice for clients? Well, the big one is even when clients aren't having a difficult time communicating with their builder, it seems that the burden of quality checking is still on clients, and a third of clients are extremely uncomfortable, so 31.7% are extremely uncomfortable with all the defects being picked up before handover. So it seems like, just based on the communication practice that we have now, current residential building practice puts a lot of pressure on those in the process that often have the least amount of knowledge on site, and it's a concern for the overall quality of buildings. Because if your client's unsure of if all the defects have picked up, they're not often in the best position to be picking up defects, but it seems the burden is often put on the client to be this kind of semi-QA on the build site, and it's unfortunate for the quality of our buildings. And then also, I think we talked about in the past slide, but 16.3%, so nearly 1 in 5 of clients, they had not come close to resolving their disagreement with their builder, I should say, not client, but builder. And so 1 in 5, and this particular client was talking about, I guess the stress that this situation created. So to the point where his boss had to step in and say, this is massively affecting you, you need to stop. But this client doesn't have any other position but to keep going forward to try and get his house fixed without having to pay somebody else to come in and fix. So what he thought was contractually obligated by the contract he signed with his builder, still fighting, as you can see, hundreds and hundreds of hours into fighting them and writing reports, getting second opinions about what he perceives as a defect, and still nowhere in sight when it comes to actually getting those fixed. On the flip side, when we're talking about implications of poor communication practice for builders, we found that the impact on mental health and well-being in particular, 77.8% of the builders that we spoke to felt their mental health and well-being impacted by client disagreements. So that's quite a significant portion of our sample who felt that just communicating with clients and having a disagreement with the client, which was, off the top of my head, was over 50%. So over 50% of our client sample said they had disagreements with their builder. We can see that's quite a large portion of builders having to go through this regularly through builds. The quote to the right is kind of talking about their process. So there's this idea here within, where the builder's talking about how you've got to wear some things, and talking about the process of, well, you can't throw your toys, you can't pull off site, you've just kind of got to bite your lip and get through it. And this idea of wearing it was quite consistent through a lot of our interviews. And it relates to the other concern that builders have when poor communication practice happens, is they're worried about the reputational risk that often occurs. So builders often, not just small builders, but the large builders as well, they trade on their reputation and trust. So builders who rely on positive referrals feel like they have to wear it. They have to make concessions, even if they're not necessarily in the wrong. Maybe they chop the price, make it a little bit more palatable for their clients, because they're afraid, well, if this client goes out and badmouths me because the reputation or the communication that we've had with them has soured, that's really bad for my business. So there's a lot of stress that incurs there as well. So when communication practice breaks down, it's not good for either of the parties involved. In terms of some kind of just more broad summary conclusions, and also looking at what practice theory can help us start to unpack these kind of complex ideas, is for builders, Elizabeth Shove talks about how practice is made up of material, competence, and meaning. And for builders in particular, this is changing. We're seeing new ways of communicating that incorporates new materials. There's new apps like Builder's app. Access to the internet means clients are coming into the build with a lot more knowledge about what's going on. There's an expectation that photography and photos are taken all the time. So the materials itself that inform the practices are changing quite a lot. And it's, as well as that, it's the competencies as well. So there's more of an emphasis being placed on interpersonal and communication skills, which currently builders aren't being taught. And of the sample that we had, good communication practice was something that was iterative. So it was formed after having these really difficult and challenging relationships with clients, where they had to step back and say, okay, so we've had a really bad communication with the client. How do we fix this? So it's been a hard-won kind of iterative change to practice. It's not something that's been taught. And their concern, builders' concern, was, well, what happens to the next generation of builders? Is this something they're aware of? The builders that we spoke to thought that clients are becoming more demanding. The new builders coming through aware of this? Are they ready for this? Do they have the skills for this? Or they have to go through a similar process as they did when they were learning their business? So that was a key concern for builders going forward as well. From a client perspective, George Ritzer and Jurgensen talks about the idea of consumers being prosumers, which I think is an interesting idea, because the clients that we're seeing on build sites who have had a disagreement or have warped into this more active client role are finding that they're having to do a lot of unpaid labor to ensure the quality of their building. And they don't necessarily have a choice, because they're already putting in $600,000, $700,000 on their build. So, I mean, they don't want to, for example, there was one couple who arrived on site and they noticed that the person had bought the wrong windows. And it took months for them to actually get the right windows that were in the contract. I think clients in this position feel compelled to work because, well, they've already paid this amount of money. They don't want to incur an additional cost because of a poor quality building. And they also don't want to pay $700,000 for a building that they didn't ask for. So there's also a compulsion here of clients having to provide unpaid labor to ensure that they get the house they want, if the relationship with their builder is not a good one to begin with. And then finally, just to talk a little bit about practice and this idea that Schatzki talks about, which is material arrangements. Material arrangements are really interesting, I think really important for looking at a study like this, because a material arrangement for Schatzki is where practice hangs off. So if you imagine a material arrangement as a coat rack, and practice of the coats that you put on a coat rack, these practices of communication between clients and builders, they hang off the actual building, the physical building that they're both working towards completing. They both have different understandings and different practices of what this building entails, and the current state of the house and the expectations of that house. So at what point in time should it be in this current state? Is it on track? Is it not? Shapes communication practice and changes how builders and clients communicate with each other. So yeah, I thank you for listening to me ramble on. And if you had any questions, I'm more than happy to answer any. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, I mean, I'm more than welcome to have a yarn. So just please contact me at my email address. And yeah, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Orin. Okay, we've got a few minutes for a couple of minutes for questions.
I've got one for you, Orin.
Oh, sure. What's up, Shamsy? Oh, no, I see Shamsy there too. What's up?
Quite interesting. I guess you said that builders often lack training and interpersonal, communication skills.
Yeah.
Like, what could be a solution around that? Because obviously it's quite a interesting situation, right? Like let's say you're at, wherever Polytech, wherever you learn that, and then you get these essential skills yet for your job. It's really critical. So what do you think could be like a solution to kind of help with that kind of thing?
So I know that I guess my thinking around this is that New Zealand certified builders have a mentorship scheme. And so what I would think is if you've already got builders who are in this position that we talked to, have been in the business for 30 years, how can we leverage mentorship schemes like that to also talk about interpersonal relationship skills? So I think it's more about making these mentorship schemes aware of, hey, this is also an issue. Could you also not just talk about on the tools work and starting out a business, but also how do you manage and negotiate clients? How can that be? I think that could just be, we're already leveraging off what I think is the knowledge that we already have in the industry, and how do we help pass that on to the next generation? So I think mentorship schemes would be quite helpful in that regard, since they're already a part of some of like NZCB at least.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I guess, especially in relation to your mental health thing too, you know, because I think that mentorship thing would be really quite useful for me, because you're able to open up and learn, you know, from someone, you know, like that. I can see that. Sounds really interesting. Another project there, Orin.
Yeah, I know. Always more projects.
Any other questions?
I could ask a question just and make a comment too, actually, as somebody who renovated a house a few years back, and I had 2 stages of things, or 3 stages actually. And the one reason I switched builder after the first was to do with communication. Like, they just did things and they didn't ask first whether that was what I wanted. And the second guy, this is the very middle class bloke and problem, isn't it? The second guy was fabulous. He was very communicative. In fact, you could hardly shut him up, but you know, it really does, makes a difference. I just also thinking about all the grand designs programs I've watched over time and how that builder-client relationship, you know, is always one of the big tensions, or, well, not always a big tension, but it's one of the big focuses, put it that way. I was just thinking about the power relations thing, the typical sociological question. You know, you sort of said that the power relations, or the power lies with the builder during the build, because they're the ones who are doing the job. But then then you were talking later on, you were talking about the power of clients, right, in terms of reputation and payment, right, and disputes. So it's sort of like the power flips. It feels like the power flips, you know, during the process, the builder has the power of doing the work, and at the end, the client has some power. So it's kind of interesting.
And that's what we definitely found too. So like, I obviously didn't speak about it in the presentation, but so builders, what clients usually complained about was it's the contract itself. So the contract was written in such a way that it protects the builder at the expense of the client. So when it comes to the client who want to push back against builders, they have to go outside of the boundaries of the contract. So the builder's always going, well, no, you've said this, you've said this, you've said this. And the client's going, no, I didn't, and I'm not paying for this. Simple as that. And so that's the stalemate that it creates. So definitely within the process, clients, that idea of like a good customer and an assertive customer, the good customer is thinking, well, this person's still building my house. I don't want to piss them off that much. Like, I still want to get a house at the end of it. But definitely for some clients, that power does shift, but they still don't have any regulatory tools or services that they can use to help push through, other than, hey, I'm not going to pay, or I'm just going to slag you off to somebody. I think it definitely flips. It's just different understandings and conceptions and uses of power, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think another thing that's really interesting is, you know, the professional knowledge, you know, and I'm sure that applies to lots of professions. And we know that people go and look up their medical symptoms and then go to the doctors, right, and say, oh, I think I've got blah, blah, blah. And, you know, that must drive doctors bananas, and it probably happens all over the place. And it's just, it's a real delicate business for builders to negotiate, eh?
Yeah, because I mean, it's not like, this is the thing that I'm still trying to unpack. It's builders don't want clients to not research. They want clients to do their due diligence, but it's like, that's the term they use, is understanding like, what is the line between you mean by due diligence? What are the things that you want clients to know? And then where is that tipping off point? And I think that tipping off point is when you start to question the actual methods, expertise, and materials that a builder chooses to do. It's like the client's job is to have a very clear vision for what they are expecting of their house, and the builder's job is to realize it, and that's where their professionalism and expertise comes in. So when a builder has that questions, that's when the frustrations start, I think. But yeah, like, what is that line? Like, how do you tell a client you've done too much research versus not enough versus, yeah, so still figuring that out, but it's very interesting what that kind of line is.